Hello students, good morning. Welcome back in my class. Myself Vishal Pandey, and today we will be discussing the next part of our chapter, and the chapter which is familiar with you all, the address. So we will be discussing the address in a detailed way. As I told you in previous lecture that the address is a story which is associated with a girl who is narrator and writer herself, and the name of the writer, as it was suggested yesterday or in the previous class, Marga Minko. She has very much influenced by the address of her mother's. She had died in the war. I told you that this chapter is based upon the Second World War. Basically, the address deals with a country which is situated in Europe, and the name of the country is Holland. So we will be discussing that how the Second World War was affected by the Nazist, you can say the dictator of the world, Adolf Hitler. We will be understanding the address. Let us move towards the projector. As you can see on the screen, children, it is the war time, and you can see the portrait on the screen. This is the sceneries of the country Holland. It has been written, and you can see the destruction which has taken place in this country because of the Second World War, because of the greediness of Adolf Hitler. This all had happened in Europe, and the whole world had suffered from these activities. So the family, the mother of Marga Minko, the writer of the address, which you have a chapter in your snapshot book, she also suffered from this war, and ultimately, or you can say unfortunately, she died in this war. As I had already told you, the name of the writer's mother, Mrs. S. She was called as by this name, Mrs. S, and you can see the portrait of Mrs. S lying on the floor. She died, and writer Marga Minko, the narrator itself, left alone. She became alone. She was all alone because her only mother died because of the war. So basically we will be discussing about the pre-war, before the war, what the story was there, and then the post-war, after the war, what had happened. We will be discussing in the next slide. So children, as I told you that all the story is surrounded by Mrs. S house. You can see on your screen a portrait of a house, a bungalow. You can see Mrs. S daughter with the narrator herself, which also known as Marga Minko, decided to bring back her mother's belongings from Mrs. Dorling. Now, who is Mrs. Dorling? I had already discussed this character before when I was doing character analysis, but let me be very familiar with you and tell you once again that Mrs. Dorling is a character, a very prominent character in the story, because she plays a very important role. She was an acquaintance of Mrs. S. So you can understand in an easy way that Mrs. Dorling was also a friend of Mrs. S. Mrs. S, the narrator's mother. So altogether, when she was suffering from the war, the Second World War itself, she gave all her belongings to Mrs. Dorling to keep them in a safe mode. So children, I hope you all understanding what I am trying to convince you all, but yet you have to keep this in your mind that whenever you see this portrait of the address, you have to keep this in your mind that you should understand each and everything of this chapter. Now when the war finishes and Mrs. S died, narrator's mother died, but narrator survives. Marga Minko survives, and when she grew up and she realized that my mother had given all the belongings to Mrs. Dorling, so she decided that she will go to Mrs. Dorling's house at once and she will demand for all her mother's belonging. So she decided that she will go to Marconi Street, house number 46, as it was suggested by Mrs. S. So in the next video, we will be discussing that how narrator visited to Marconi Street, house number 46, and how ultimately she find out the address of Mrs. Dorling. So wait for the next update to come. Thank you.